However, on this week's parsha is Parsha Shelach, in which famously the Chet HaMeraglim is described in context in Parakim Yud Gimel and Yud the Bnei Yisrael famously, through the advice or through Moshe's permission, send out 12 people on a shim to tour out the land and, in a sense, to go out on a spy mission. The Ramban has much to comment on this, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the Ramban's brief commentary to the start of this parak. And specifically, we're going to try and view in context what occurs in Parak Tet Vav, 2 parakim later in the parsha. Very interestingly, we're going to see how in Parak Tet Vav, after the story of the Meraglim seems to end, where we end up that a further group of Bnei Yisrael goes up and tries to go to the land, the Ma'apilim as we refer to them, because they buy a Pilu Lalot al Rosh Har, and they go up and they do not have the armor with them, and they fail. And this group of people do not reach the land of Israel. They are instead, they're destroyed. Other nations destroy them in the area. They do not, unfortunately, make it to Israel. Though we know, as we bloated last week, that Bnei Israel had a choice to be able to get themselves up to the land of Israel, to elevate and go on a simple 3-day journey, to follow God's command, to be able to reach the land of Israel. So the question that occurs is, all the Mefarshim focus on, immediately after this aftermath of the Meraglim and the Mampilim that we most famously focus on within our Parsha, there's some less focused area where we discuss the Korban Nesachim, the wine libations, where wine is poured on the Mizbeach in different areas in the Beit HaMikdash. And Bnei Yisrael's command is specifically at this juncture, seemingly out of the blue. Now, this area over here continues within the lane, and you just go right into it. From the story of the Meraglim, not even a new aliyah, go straight into it. Now, what we're going to try and do is, I saw something interesting online through looking at the Yeshivat Har Tzion. They posted a nice video from Rav Amnon Bazak and also Rav Yaakov Meidan discussing this. I'll post a link in the comments. Though specifically, they were discussing how this parak fits into the context of the parsha. Now, the Mefarshim all discussed that the beginning of Parak Tet Vav is some sort of nechama, some sort of consolation or comfort to Bnei Yisrael. As the Psukim continue over here, and in Pasuk Bet we read about the Beryl Bnei Yisrael, after Bnei Yisrael seems to have failed, and they cry for legitimate reasons, perhaps for illegitimate reasons, though they cry the fact that they are punished. They were this nation and this current nation, this 20 to 60-year-old gap, where all the people who are living within that time were not going to be able to make it to the land of Israel. The next generation will carry the torch, though there is a mourning that occurs. And what happens next, there's a nechama. Bnei Yisrael is given a commandment that will happen to them when they will enter into the land. This is a promise that there will not be a continual cycle of 40 years and a further sin to distance Bnei Yisrael. They will enter the land after 40 years. God promises them that. Now, what's interesting, though, is that there are other ways of understanding this. And this is what I saw in the video from Rav Zak and Rav Meidan, that if you look at this parsha specifically, it shows a unique idea that perhaps could be fleshed out best when we look back at the parsha Balotcha, where there's a simple sense of unity and following commands that goes with a very precise and decisive and instructive measure that's given clearly in Parak Tet Vav here, where all these commands, very simplistic, follow the rules. 3 times we have this word kacha over here. And that's the idea that Rabbi Zak was pointing out, that Bnei Yisrael has to follow the commands here. They're given something that shows them you have a purpose, you have something you can accomplish. Meaning that it comes down to the end of the day, when Bnei Yisrael face these decisions, they can follow God's will and they will be able to enter the land immediately. They just have to follow this way of kacha. That's one way of looking at this. We go look back in Parsha Balotcha and see how that fits into a larger scheme. And we'll start off by looking at the beginning of the downhill, we could call it, where Bnei Yisrael seems to be going a little bit downhill. When we look all the way back into Parsha Balotcha, and I think we'll look at, let's say, Parak Yud Bet there. And in the immediate aftermath, before Bnei Yisrael complains, we mentioned the 3 psukim last week with regard to Bnei Yisrael following the Aron that would allow them to enter straight into the land. Something that Rabbi Zak pointed out is immediately in the passage right before this, Moshe is speaking to Chovav ben Ruel, whether he's Yitro or not is a whole discussion, though seemingly we'll assume he's Yitro for now. And Moshe tells Yitro, be out a scout for us, be someone who's able to assist us. Now, what was interesting that Rabbi Zak pointed out, this idea of a naim, of someone else having to act for us, will be understood a little bit in a sense of a choser emunah, a lack of understanding, a lack of faith, a lack of complete understanding of God's will, perhaps. And if we can understand in this way that Bnei Yisrael and Moshe are told us to follow the commands, they're told to keep it simple, really. And when you're faced with a decision, you follow God's will, and you'll be able to enter land, and you'll be able to by being so around. That's a big problem we see all throughout Sefer Bamidbar. Bnei Israel is faced with the problem of decision, and they unfortunately don't make the right decision. Now, this all ends off with this idea of Einayim, famously in the Chet of the Meraglim itself. We'll fast forward to Perek Gimel, Shlach Anashim, Be'atur Eretz Canaan, to look out and scout the land. And what happens? Bnei Yisrael comes back, the 12 Meraglim come back, and 10 of them come back with a report that seems to view the land in a negative manner. And this aspect of Re'iyah, of scouting the land and coming back with a negative report, is clearly tied into this aspect of Vayitan B'Einayim. Follow God's command. There's a whole big discussion within the Ramban about how Bnei Yisrael, what was their sin here, though nonetheless, part of the sin is this lack of Amunah, this lack of simply following the commands. Bnei Yisrael didn't necessarily need this spyship, whatever it may be. And this all ends off at the end of the parsha. After we're given the commands in Perek Vav, follow this, everyone together. Everyone has the same sort of rules. Then we read about in the end of the parsha, mitzvah tzitzit, to remind us, this idea of following our eyes for the ayin tova is something that specifically Bnei Yisrael is being shown here. And that's something that's huge for Sefer Bamidbar as a whole. To end off, we see clearly in Perek Vav of following the commands and making the right choice in these decisions is something that a nation has to be able to understand to move forward in Eretz Yisrael. And that perhaps is what Bnei Yisrael is accomplishing here. And to quote one of my Rebbeim from Gush as well, Rav Menachem Liebtag, that Bnei Yisrael, when they enter into the Midbar, they are just a vision of a nation. They have the potential to be a nation. But when they leave the Midbar, they need to be a nation with a vision. They need to be united. And when we see that coming off of Har Sinai, Bnei Yisrael seems to run away, and things begin to go downhill, as we discussed in Parshat Balotcha. And now Bnei Yisrael is faced with more decisions, and we'll see that throughout Sefer Bamidbar. And we've seen that they are, while they are a vision of a nation, they need to become a nation of a vision. For that to occur, they need to make the right decisions. And perhaps Perek Vav is showing us, it's simple. You'll enter the land, but you'll have to follow the commands, have to have the complete emunah, and make the right decisions. And with that, Bnei Yisrael can enter in the land successfully. And we can all take some sort of understanding and take away from this about following God's commands and having that sense of emunah that will bring us to the Holy Land. Have good jobs, everyone.